My name is Gloria Latson-Billings, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the speaker for this session. This is a session on Distinguished Contribution to Education Research Award, and our awardee is no stranger. He is well known. I actually have some actual things I'm supposed to say because I did get the information, but I must tell you that this is a colleague I have known for more than 40 years. In 1970, I was at the University of Wisconsin. He was a young, energetic assistant professor, and I was excited to be able to be there and know him. But James A. Banks is the Carrie and Linda Killinger Endowed Chair in Diversity Studies, Emeritus, and is the founding director of the Center for Multicultural Education at the University of Washington, which is now the Banks Center for Educational Justice. He was the Russell F. Stark University professor at the University of Washington from 2001 to 2006. Professor Banks is the past president of the American Educational Research Association and the National Council for the Social Studies. He is a specialist in social studies education, multicultural education, and diversity and citizenship education, and has written widely in these fields. His books include Teaching Strategies for Ethnic Studies, Cultural Diversity in Education, Foundations, Curriculum, and Teaching, Educating Citizens in a Multicultural Society, Race, Culture, and Education, The Selected Works of James A. Banks, and Diversity, Transformative Knowledge, and Civic Education, Selected Essays. Professor Banks is the editor of the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education, the Rutledge International Companion to Multicultural Education, Diversity and Citizenship Education, Global Perspectives, the Encyclopedia of Diversity in Education and Citizenship Education and Global Migration, Implications for Theory, Research, and Teaching. He is also the editor of the Multicultural Education series of books published by Teachers College Press, Columbia University. In 2020, there were more than 70 books published in this series, with others in various stages of development. Professor Banks is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association and a member of the National Academy of Education and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Research by Professor Banks on how educational institutions can improve race and ethnic relations has greatly influenced schools, colleges, and universities throughout the United States and the world. He is often called the father of multicultural education. Professor Banks has given lectures on citizenship education and diversity in many nations, including Australia, Canada, China, Cyprus, England, France, Germany, Greece, Hong Kong, Iceland, Ireland, Israel, Japan, Kenya, Korea, Malaysia, Norway, Portugal, Russia, Scotland, Singapore, Sweden, Turkey, and New Zealand. His books have been translated into Greek, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Turkish, and Arabic. Ladies and gentlemen, James A. Banks.
Thank you, Gloria, for that warm and kind introduction that comes from a dear, dear friend that I've known for longer than I care to think about. I think she called it 40 years. I thought it was 50, but take her figure instead of mine. I would like to thank her for that really wonderful and glorious introduction. I am grateful to the AERA committee that selected me as the recipient of the 2023 Distinguished Contributions to Research and Education Award. All of my life, I never thought I would get this award because you think of it going to really famous people, and I never think of myself that way. But when I received the call, I was in disbelief, and I was to be honored by your own people, your own family, that is always so heart-wrenching and deeply appreciated. I'd like to thank past President Eva Baker, who chaired the committee that selected me, and she graciously introduced me when I received the award in Chicago last year. I would like to give a special thanks and an expression of appreciation to Dr. Cherry A. McGee Banks. Cherry, raise your hand or stand up. Cherry Banks, my wife and colleague, we've shared a rich and rewarding personal and intellectual journey for 55 years. Cherry she's read everything I've written or what I was about to write. She knows before I write it. Cherry has given me unwavering support during our shared quest for social justice and equity. I would also like to acknowledge my dean, Mia Twan. Is Mia here? She was going to try to get here, but deans can't always control their schedule. I would also like to thank my colleagues from the University of Washington School of Education, and I do see Kathy Taylor, who've always, my colleagues at Washington have been a great source of support. That's why I stayed there for 50 years. I was telling a colleague I'd been in Washington for 50 years. She said, really? I said, I came young. I was 28. Some of my students was about my age when I came to Washington in 1969. The title of my talk is My Epistemological Journey, the quest for educational equity in a national and global context. I grew up on my parents' cotton farm near the town of Marianna, Arkansas, which is about 60 miles from Memphis, Tennessee. Marianna, like all towns in the former Confederate South, was tightly segregated during the 50s and 60s when I came of age. Segregation, racism, and white hegemony were institutionalized in Marianna, as it was in the other states that made up the Confederacy. A statue of Robert E. Lee was in the center of town and dominated the town square. There was a black movie theater and a white one. Blacks had to enter the white theater through an upstairs entrance and view the movies in a room that also housed the projector, which the clicking sound of the projector made it difficult to hear the actors in the movie. First run and newly released movies were shown only in the white theater. A similar situation existed in black schools, which used old textbooks that had been abandoned by the white schools. As an elementary age student, I wondered silently what caused the inequalities that were salient within my community and school. I wondered, for example, why I had to walk 5 miles to and from schools each day, while the white students took a school bus, which often passed us while we were walking and splashed mud on us. That is one of my poignant memories. One of my most powerful memories is the images of the happy and loyal enslaved African Americans in the textbook. Didn't make any sense to me as a kid why the enslaved people would be happy, because we weren't happy. I mean, why would they be happy? That didn't make any sense to me. We were not happy with the racism. We were resilient and defiant, not happy. And so it didn't make sense to me. I also wondered as a young student why there were only 3 other blacks in our textbook. Booker T. Washington, the educator, Marian Anderson, the opera singer, and George Washington Carver, the scientist. Were there other blacks who should have been in our textbook? The questions that I began to ask as a child during my segregated school experience have led me to a lifetime of questioning, research, and exploration into first African American history, then ethnic studies, multicultural education, civic education, global education, and finally into the ways in which knowledge construction and civic education are interrelated in the United States and in other nations. It was not until I was in graduate school that I learned that the historian who created the image of the happy enslaved people was Ulrich B. Phillips, who was a descendant of Georgia's slaveholders. His book, American Negro Slavery, published in 1918, described this benign view of enslaved people that existed throughout the American universities and schools until the 1950s, largely unquestioned. However, African American historians, such as Carter G. Woodson and W.B. Du Bois, questioned Ulrich Phillips' research when it was first published. My experience growing up in the segregated South and learning about the ways the images of blacks had been institutionalized within the schools and the society writ large initiated an epistemological journey that resulted in my focusing much of my life's work on uncovering and describing how knowledge is constructed and established within schools, colleges, and universities. One of the really important dimensions of this research, of my autobiographical journey, led to me to understand the ways in which race, class, and gender affects the knowledge that social scientists and historians construct. Feminists call this phenomenon positionality, an important concept that emerged within feminist work. Another important component of my research focuses on how knowledge is perceived, privileged, and institutionalized within society. I created a knowledge typology that has helped teachers and students determine how knowledge is constructed, used, and evaluated. I will first describe positionality and then the types of knowledge that I've created. The notion of positionality, when I read it in the feminist literature, became very important to me and as I focused my work. Positionalities describe the ways in which race, gender, and class, and other cultural variables influence the research and interpretations that historians, social scientists, and other researchers create. Sandra Harding, Patricia Collins, and Lorraine Code have written extensively about positionality. And their work has been very important to me as I have struggled with this work over nearly 5 decades. They point out the need for researchers and scholars to identify their ideological position and normative perspectives in their work, which is an inherent part of feminist scholarship. However, the assumption within the Western empirical paradigm is that the knowledge produced within it is neutral and objective, and that its principles are universal. That's what Arthur Jensen claimed when he wrote about the inferiority of Black intelligence in 1969 in his Harvard Educational Review article that filled up the whole volume of one of the issues of Harvard Educational Review. However, scholars such as Gunnar Myrdal and Kenneth B. Clark, prior to the ethnic studies and feminist movements, wrote about the needs for scholars to recognize and state their normative positions and valuations, is what Myrdal called it. The need to to identify the normative positions and valuations, and to become, in the apt words of Kenneth B. Clark, the African-American psychologist, they need to become involved observers. Myrdal stated that valuations are not just attached to research, but permeate it. He wrote, and I quote, "There is no device for excluding biases in social sciences than to phase the valuations and to introduce them as explicitly stated, specific, and sufficiently concretized value premises." That was Gunnar Myrdal, who did the famous study of racism in the United States called The American Dilemma. And if you don't know Myrdal's work, you should become familiar with it. Postmodern and critical theories such as Habermas, Giraud, and feminist theories such as Code, Collins, and Harding have developed important critiques of empirical knowledge. They argue that despite its claims, modern science is not value-free, but contains important human interests and normative assumptions that should be identified, discussed, and examined. Code, a feminist epistemologist, states that academic knowledge is both subjective and objective, and that both aspects should be recognized and discussed. Code states that we need to ask these kinds of questions. Out of whose subjectivity has the ideal of objectivity grown? Whose standpoint, whose values does it represent? She raises this question in her book, What Can She Know? Feminist Theory in the Construction of Knowledge. The question she raises is the sex of the knower epistemologically significant? Is the sex of the knower epistemologically significant? She answers the question in the affirmative because of the ways in which gender influences how knowledge is constructed, interpreted, and institutionalized. The ethnic and cultural experience of the knower are also epistemologically significant because these factors also influence knowledge construction, use, and interpretation. Empirical scholarship has been limited by the assumption and biases that are implicit within it. However, these values and assumptions are often not recognized by professors, teachers, and students. And the lack of this recognition of bias and assumptions have often led to negative consequences for people of color, such as African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, because of the stereotypes and misconceptions that have been perpetuated about these groups in research and in teaching materials. I have drawn upon the work of epistemological researchers and theories to develop a knowledge typology that I will describe. I identify 5 types of knowledge in this conception: personal cultural knowledge, popular knowledge, mainstream academic knowledge, and transformative academic knowledge, as well as pedagogical knowledge. Each of these types of knowledge are described in this slide. However, in this lecture, and because of time limitations, I will only discuss mainstream academic knowledge and transformative knowledge. Mainstream academic knowledge consists of the facts, concepts, explanations, and interpretations that constitute traditional Western-centric knowledge in history and the behavioral and social sciences. Transformative knowledge consists of facts, concepts, explanations, and interpretation that challenge mainstream academic knowledge and expand and revise established canons, paradigms, theories, explanations, and research methods. Transformative academic knowledge assumes that knowledge is not neutral, but is influenced by human interests, and that all knowledge reflects the power and social relationship within society. And of course, the contrast I'm trying to make here is that the traditional assumption of mainstream knowledge is that the biases of the researcher are not reflected. And transformative knowledge assumes that those values do affect the knowledge and that they should be made explicit, such as Kenneth Clark argues, as I noted earlier. During my career, I have used editing as a vehicle to infuse transformative knowledge into the mainstream knowledge. Examples of these editing projects are the Handbook of Research on Multicultural Education, the second edition of which was published in 2004 and which is co-edited by Sherry McGee Banks. Another example of my editing to infuse transformative knowledge is a series of books that I edit for Teachers College Press, the Multicultural Education series, and currently there are about 80 published books in that series, with others at various stages of development. Another editing project in which I tried to infuse transformative knowledge into the mainstream knowledge was the Encyclopedia of Diversity in Education, which was published in 4 volumes by Sage in 2012. In my work, I have tried to use the concept of mainstream and transformative knowledge to analyze and illuminate concepts in civic education. Civic education in the United States, as well as in other nations, is undergirded by mainstream academic knowledge. And I argue that civic education must be reimagined and transformed to effectively educate students from diverse groups. And so I want to contrast mainstream civic education with transformative civic education. Mainstream civic education is grounded in mainstream knowledge and assumptions, and the assimilation is ideology. It reinforces the status quo and the dominant power relationship in society. It does not challenge or disrupt the class, racial, and gender discrimination within schools and society. Transformative civic education is rooted in transformative academic knowledge. It enables students to acquire the knowledge, skills, and values needed to challenge inequality within their communities, their nations, and the world, and to take action to create just and democratic multicultural communities in society. Transformative civic education also helps students to develop clarification of their cultural identity, and as well as to internalize the democratic ideologies of the nation, to become global, to inculcate a global identity, as well as a regional identity. What has happened in the schools, however, in mainstream civic education, is that it has been assumed that identity is a zero-sum game, and so that students have been alienated often in mainstream civic education from their cultural identities, with the assumption being that you can't have a cultural identity as well as a national identity. So that kids have been forced to internalize self-alienation within school with the assimilation as ideology. Whereas transformative civic education, the idea is that kids can have cultural identities as well as national identities, because these identities interact and intersect. In terms of looking at citizen identity, I've developed a conceptualization of citizenship, of a citizenship typology that consists of 4 categories: failed citizenship, recognized citizenship, participatory citizenship, and transformative citizenship. And I will discuss each of these briefly in turn. The social, cultural, and political context in many nations, as well as within mainstream civic education, result in many students from marginalized groups experiencing what I call failed citizenship. Failed citizenship exists when individuals or groups who are born within a nation or migrate to it and live within it for an extended period of time and do not internalize the values and identities of the nation state, feel structurally excluded within it, and have highly ambivalent feelings toward the nation state. Individuals who experience failed citizenship focus primarily on their own needs for political efficacy, group identity, and structural inclusion, rather than on the overarching and shared goals of the nation state. They remain alienated within the nation state, and their commitment to the nation state is eclectic and complex. And recognized citizenship exists when the state or nation publicly recognizes an individual or group as legitimate, legal, and valued members of the polity, and provides an individual or group full rights and opportunities to participate. They may or may not participate, but they have the ability. Participatory citizenship is exercised by individuals and groups who've been granted recognized citizenship by the nation state. An example of participatory citizenship is the action taken by civil rights groups to enable African Americans to vote after the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. What about transformative citizens? Transformative citizens take action to implement and promote policies, actions, and changes that are consistent with values such as human rights, social justice, and equality. The action that transformative citizens take, and that they might take, and sometimes do, and often violate existing local, state, or national laws. Examples are action taken by transformative citizens such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Rosa Parks, who violated state or national laws, but helped to actualize values such as human rights and social justice. I am now involved in a project to focus equity in a global context. And this, the last part of my talk, will describe 3 major projects in which I am involved that takes the work that I'm doing within a global context. And this work has been going on since 2002. I'll talk about 3 global projects, and then I'll end my talk and entertain questions. The first project that I'm going to talk about, I'll talk about these projects in turn. The first one will be the project on citizenship education that was held at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center in Italy in 2002. And the goal of that project was to talk about how nation states around the world balance unity and diversity. The next project took place at the Talaris Conference Center near the University of Washington campus in 2015. And it's focused on structural inclusion, political efficacy, and civic participation. And the current project that I'm involved in is involved with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, developing an issue of Daedalus, their quarterly journal, that will focus on the global quest for educational equity and will be published in October. Let me talk about each of these projects in turn, starting off with the Bellagio project in 2002. And this project, you can see, these were the participants. I think they were from about 12 nations. Let me look at my notes. Yeah, they're from 12 nations. And a major goal of this project was to identify the problems and issues related to designing a civic education program that promotes the civic participation of all groups within the nation state while respecting cultural differences. The conference explored how educators could create civic education programs that balance unity and diversity. The book that resulted from this project was published in 2004, is entitled Diversity in Citizenship Education, Global Perspectives. And one of the findings, conclusions of this conference was that globalization and nationalism are coexisting and sometimes conflicting trends and forces in the world today. Another conclusion of the Bellagio Conference is that citizenship and citizenship education are defined and implemented differently in various social, cultural, economic, and political contexts, and that it is also a contested notion in all of these nations. The book that resulted from this program served as the basis for a consensus panel that I created to develop guidelines for public school educators to develop the guidelines related to helping students develop political efficacy. And this is the book, this is the panel, and it included colleagues from the UK, from Canada, and this was a very popular publication that came out of that's a consensus report that came out of the Bellagio project. The next project was the Talaris Conference held near the University of Washington campus at the Talaris Center in June of 2015. The momentous events that occurred in nations around the world between the Bellagio Conference in 2002 and the Talaris Conference in 2015 made it appropriate and timely to assemble another group of scholars and researchers in multicultural education and civic education to revisit and assess the status and theory in civic education in different nations. And the follow-up conference that you can see here, which involved scholars from 16 nations that spent about several days at this conference. The book that resulted from this conference, published by AERA, by the way, was one of the sponsors of this project. The other sponsor was the Spencer Foundation. The book that resulted from this project is called Citizenship Education and Global Migration, Implications for Theory, Research, and Teaching. One of the major conclusions of this project was that we need to facilitate the structural inclusion of students into their nation states. And structural inclusion is defined in this project as a set of attitudes and beliefs that students have which are characterized by a feeling of political efficacy, political empowerment, and a belief that they can influence political and academic decisions that affect their lives by participating in the political system. In other words, students who feel structurally included within the civic culture of the nation have political efficacy and a belief that their participation in the polity can make a difference. The final project that I'm going to talk about, which is ongoing, and I see two of the authors, Jason two of the authors from our report in the audience here. In December 2022, the Council of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences approved an edition of Daedalus, its quarterly publication, to be edited by me that would focus on the global quest for educational equity. They appointed me as editor, and I came up with the topic, which they had to approve, of course. And you can see the participants in that project, and some of them you know, I'm sure. This special issue of Daedalus will be published in October of this year. The authors' meeting, which was held at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, Massachusetts, from October the 29th to November 1st of 2023, and it was supported by the Spencer Foundation. And this meeting had about 4 major goals. First was simply to provide a forum where the authors would share insights with colleagues from various nations, and also to use that to revise their papers. They wrote their papers before the conference and revised them after the conference. Another goal of this project was, of course, for the authors to receive feedback from the other authors. And another goal for them, again, was to exchange ideas. And finally, the goal was to develop a network, which we will keep going through, making presentations at AERA, the National Association for Multicultural Education, and the International Association for Intercultural Education. This issue of Daedalus describes theory, research, and practices which nations in various parts of the world are developing using to increase equity for diverse groups in elementary and secondary schools around the world. By the way, you'll be able to, Daedalus is a journal that has free access digitally on the internet to all scholars. So you'll be able to download it free when it's published in October. In summary, my socialization in the Arkansas Delta gave me a unique gaze, enabled me to see that the way that African Americans were depicted in textbooks didn't make any sense. And my experience started me on an epistemological journey that's undergoing and being modified as life changes and develops. In conclusion, I'd like to share a poem by my favorite poet, Langston Hughes. The marginalization and identity quests by diverse groups across the world are causing a dream deferred. Hughes writes, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Banks, and I am sure there are people in this audience who know that they have you cited in their work. That's the real proof of the pudding. A lot of us do a lot of writing, but don't nobody do the reading of what we write. Well, we read his work. We have about, maybe 15, 17 minutes to take questions. We do have microphones in the aisle, so if you would step to the microphone to raise your questions, Dr. Banks would be happy to respond.
Yes.
And I think we need you to go to the mic because I think the session is recorded, so we want to hear your voice. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. James Banks. I am very honored to be here. And I would like to add I am from Colombia. And we have this similar discussion. So I would like that you could tell more when you are thinking the global perspective in education, because as you know, there are a huge diversity that has been hard to account in only one theoretical approach and methodological approaches too. So yeah, that is my question, and mainly related when we are talking about ethnic studies courses and multicultural societies.
Okay. I think we need to make intersections between the cultural, the global, the national, and I think that we really need to help students understand how they're interconnected, starting with their own culture, to use as a lens for extending out and looking at their nation and the rest of the world. I don't know if that speaks directly to your question, but I think that's one thing that I was trying to convey.
Dr. Banks, it's always an honor to listen to you, and I'm sure that is something that is echoed by many of my people here. Let's talk about the notion of positionality, because that is an issue for all of us practitioners struggle with, because we are there to tell our students that life can be better than where they are, that where they are does not determine their future. Yet those forces, whether it is here, by the way, my name is Peter Diangui, I am in Florida, and the forces that are going on there are telling them otherwise. I come from Kenya, and the forces I left there are telling them otherwise. How do I make this kid believe that that notion of positionality does not determine their future, and it's better than what they have now?
Well, I think in talking about the notion of positionality, I think that we first need to help students understand how to understand their own positionality as a framework for then understanding others, and to help them understand that statements in social science often have the positionality is obscured or not explicit. And I think we need to help them understand how to illuminate and to articulate what that positionality is.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jensen, for example, said that his research on Black intelligence was totally objective, and that there was nothing influencing it but science. And so, but it was a very detrimental kind of conception. And we saw, of course, the positionality coming out of Germany during the 50s about the of various groups there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Banks, for all your work and your legacy. And it has definitely influenced my life and many, many people's lives. I'm Marlon James. I'm a professor at Prairie View A&M University in Texas. And I have a question about your framework, your knowledge construction framework, and where the current efforts particularly in states like Texas, to actually deconstruct or reduce knowledge. Where does that fit with all these new laws coming out restricting what can and cannot be taught? I like your new knowledge construction framework, but I was wondering where that fits in and what type of citizenship might those type of efforts.
Well, I think those efforts are meant to undercut and hide behind very decisive notions to undercut equity and social justice. And so I think the whole purpose of what's happening in Florida, for example, to deny, to say that slavery empowered us. That's how we learned the skills. I think those notions are very deliberate efforts that are masking as not influenced by values, that are masking as being objective, but the very purpose is to undercut justice, freedom, and equality. So I think the purpose of those movements are very deliberate because we have made some progress over the last 40 years. So I think it's like a war that these people, and they have a lot of money.
A lot of money.
And so I think it's a very deliberate effort to undercut social justice and equality.
Thank you, sir.
And I think kids need to understand the very deliberate ways in which these actions are being taken.
Hi, Dr. Banks. I was fortunate enough to go to Ghana last summer, and I know you talked about all the countries you've been to, and I went to an impoverished school there, and the group I was with, we brought them a lot of resources. But I just wondered if you had been to Ghana and if you had dealt with any of the schools over there.
I have not been to Ghana, but I would love to.
Okay. Okay, well, if you
I have a few more years.
if you need anybody to go with you to do a study, let me know.
Yeah. Chair, I think it's right. I've only been to Kenya, right? In Africa. Just to Kenya. And Senegal for you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Sayed, and I'm in Texas. But my question refers to some work I was doing at the national level with the National Council for the Social Studies. And I was wondering, since positionality is so important within social science, whether or not social studies K through 12 education is an appropriate place for students to interrogate their identity.
What the social studies is
K through 12 social studies, should they interrogate their identity there?
Yeah, I think identity is central to social studies and understanding, because so often what happens in school, when I was in school and often now, kids are asked to give up their identity, become self-alienated, and just become quote-unquote American, which means Anglo-American. And so black kids and Latino kids and American Indian kids are asked to become alienated from their identity. But I think we need to build upon kids' identity. And and research indicates that the stronger they understand their identity, the more likely they are to develop a self-actualized national identity. So starting first with their own identity, and then helping them understand how that relates, they can develop a more thoughtful and national identity and global identity. I see Carol Hahn in the audience. She could talk a lot about
Okay,
global identity. She's my colleague who's done so much work in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. There are some people who are not agreeing with me on that fact, and because of the political pressure. So now I will use you as evidence for.
Gloria, are you keeping time? Because I'm not. One more? Yes.
Great, I get to be the last. My question is multifaceted, probably because of my background.
Take one back.
I'm going to try. So International education, often when we talk in this realm, is talked about from the higher ed perspective, not the K-12 international schools around the world. And so I'm wondering about the positionality there, the global context there, when a lot of the times these are American and different cultured students who come to university here, and they're being taught in an international school any place around the world, Colombia, Ghana, Jamaica, China, et cetera. And they're being taught, well, because of the mere nature of being in an international school, they are intercultural, and the people teaching them are intercultural, but they do not have this knowledge base. And so I'm in the work that you're doing even more so recently, I'm wondering about your advice to advance the understanding of multicultural, intercultural education in an international scope, and the local context of that scope, because, for example, in some areas, in Latin America or some countries, for example, it's racism. People will say there's no racism, but there is, but it's known more as colorism. Or people think that while we say things are Eurocentric or Western-centric, likewise, when we talk about racism and sexism, it's more US-centric. So your advice on how to more globalize that to let our voices be heard in that work.
Yeah, because in my understanding, I'm not a special in international schools, but in my understanding that many of them are quite elitist and very Western-centric, and they don't really deal with the cultures of diversity and the cultures of the student. So I think those schools often need to be, some of their notions need to be deconstructed, and they need to become more transformative. And really deal with the world as it is. It's really changing. And so I think they need to be, if you will, transformed and enlightened. So I think the work that I've talked about needs to be introduced to those kinds of schools, because my understanding that they're very often very Anglo-centric and Western-centric, and not really open to the diversity of the world. Thank you very much, then, for coming.